Welcome everyone. Today we're going to talk about HITRUST's newest offering called HITRUST E1. So the title of our video today is called Getting Started with HITRUST E1 Foundational Cybersecurity. Our agenda for today is to talk a little bit about what is HITRUST's newest product offering, what is the business case for why you might want to consider E1, what is the process to go through Readiness and get the assessment done and achieve certification? What's a typical timeline? And then we've got some rapid fire question and answer at the end. So without further ado, let's get started. What is HITRUST E1? Bottom line up front, HITRUST E1 is HITRUST's newest offering, really a foundational cybersecurity certification. And we've got a few key attributes that we'll jump into. So HITRUST E1 stands for 1 year essentials. So it's something that you would achieve and then repeat every year to maintain certification. A second attribute here is only 44 static controls spread across 19 security domains. And this is built on a bunch of different frameworks. HITRUST went through a pretty rigorous process to distill the 44 most important risk-based controls that they felt represented cybersecurity hygiene and essentials that every firm needs to have. So instead of having a robust set of controls that might be a little bit too burdensome for most businesses, they distilled it down to 44. Which really reduces the barrier and allows HITRUST to be something that could be achieved by any size organization. Let's see, the third attribute we want to highlight is it relies on minimal consideration of policy and procedure documentation. So if you're at all familiar with HITRUST's original product offering, R2, it was very, very heavy on policy and procedure documentation. Companies would often have to put up a big effort to create all the policies and the procedures for each of the 19 domains. And based on the number of requirements statement, it was a pretty large exercise. E1, not so. It's just not a focus of the E1 product offering. The fourth attribute we want to highlight here is, and just double down on, is this is entry-level security assurance. So this isn't a high degree of assurance. This isn't a moderate degree of assurance. This is really entry level. So if you're trying to get your foot in the door, get a cybersecurity certification for your organization, or even get your foot in, with HITRUST, this is really a good first step. Very low barriers to entry. Let's see, the fifth attribute we wanted to highlight is in form and function, very similar to HITRUST I1 product offering. Still uses the MyCSF tool from HITRUST to conduct the assessment and to submit everything that needs to be submitted to HITRUST for the certification and quality assurance. Like I1 and actually R2, each of these certifications require the use of an authorized external assessor firm, such as Risk360, to actually perform the testing and submit everything to HITRUST. There's also an opportunity to inherit third-party operated security controls. So if you have outsourced some of the operation of your security controls to a third party, maybe it's a cloud service provider or something like that, you will be able to inherit any controls that might be operated by them under their HITRUST certification. The scoring rubric is only focused on the implemented maturity level. So unlike R2, we're not looking at a lot of policy procedures. We're really looking at, are those 44 controls implemented? Are they in place? If so, fantastic. Same CAP and GAP scoring as I1 assessments as well. And the idea really was to nest these different product offerings under HITRUST certification scheme so that some organizations will start with E1. They may choose or may be asked by their partners and clients to progress to a more mature product offering, such as I1, where they're building out a lot more controls to create that moderate degree of assurance. For other organizations where the risk profile is lower, or there's no requirement to do so. Some firms will just stay with the E1 over time. And then just to highlight, all quality assurance and all certification and report issuance is done by HITRUST. All right, let's look at E1 versus I1. Those are very similar, like I said, in form and function. This is the breakdown of requirement statements across the 19 domains. So you can see for I1 in the blue, 182 requirement statements, pretty robust set of security controls there. For E1, you can see with only 44, we are just barely scratching the surface of baseline cybersecurity hygiene. So not robust, not a great level of assurance, but it is a good entry level for firms that either are pursuing their first security certification or want to demonstrate compliance with HITRUST, but just don't have the appetite or the bandwidth to go with an I1 or an R2 type of certification. All right, let's get back here to our overall agenda. We've talked about what is HITRUST E1. Let's now jump into the business case. So why would an organization want to pursue E1? Why does E1 matter? Well, like I mentioned, with only 44 requirement statements in scope, the actual barriers to entry to achieve HITRUST compliance and certification have really been reduced by about 75%, I would say. So this has really made it feasible for any organization to go out there and achieve HITRUST compliance, get their certification, be able to share that with their partner organizations and clients. This just wasn't available before E1 was rolled out because the barriers to entry were still quite robust. Like we mentioned, this is a foot in the door to HITRUST. So if you're needing to demonstrate compliance, or you just want to go to market, with a HITRUST certification and highlight your security program, to your prospective customers, this is a great way to do it. Implementation of 44 controls is going to be a lot faster than it would be for an I1 or an R2. So you're really looking at anywhere from 3 to 9 months, depending on the big factor is just remediation. How long does it take you to get through all the gaps that you may have among those 44 controls? I like to say the effort for an E1 is not dissimilar to SOC 2. If you're familiar with the SOC 2 report, SOC 2 is different in that the criteria are specified by the AICPA. Firms design controls to meet those criteria, but really just for the security trust service category, most firms are usually looking at around 75 unique controls. So you can see that is a lot more similar to E1, versus an I1, which is 182. So if you're familiar with SOC 2, this is going to feel a lot similar to a SOC 2 type of audit. Again, the business case for it, this is allowing small organizations, startups, and companies that have a low risk profile to get their foot in the door with HITRUST and demonstrate that they do have the foundational cybersecurity elements in place. So a real good opportunity there. And then lastly, like I mentioned or alluded to, this could be a destination assessment for a lot of firms that are not being required to pursue a higher degree of assurance. This could just be a destination for them. Maybe E1 is all they need. Maybe they don't host a lot of EPHI. They're not doing a lot of things with customer data. So their risk profile is low, and organizations just aren't asking them to go above the E1. In those cases, this is a destination type of assessment. But in other cases, this could be a good stepping stone. So if you're being asked by, organizations to go ahead and get the I1 or the R2, you might say, hey, we're not ready for that yet, but we do want to achieve something this year. E1 is a great way to go ahead and demonstrate your compliance, your commitment to maturing your security posture, and it's achievable within a year, which is great. All right. And lastly, HITRUST E1 can be paired with SOC 2 as part of a single framework strategy. This is something we like to talk about a lot at Risk 360, and the reason is a lot of organizations are being asked to get a lot of different certifications or reports, there's a large overlap among those, and it becomes very difficult for organizations to focus on their business when every 3 to 6 months they have a different audit for a different certification scheme. Because there's so much overlap with SOC 2 and E1, what we're telling our clients is there's a great opportunity to approach both of those under a single audit and have two different reporting mechanisms. Verse 360 is both a CPA firm and a HITRUST external assessor. So we are able to do both of those as a single audit. The HITRUST certification ultimately is issued by HITRUST. The SOC 2 report is issued by us. But this is a much better experience for an organization being audited because you have a single audit with two reporting mechanisms. So there are a lot of efficiencies to be shared, a lot of costs to be saved when approaching it that way. All right, back to our agenda. Let's dive into E1 readiness and the assessment process. So there's really 4 steps, or we like to highlight 4 steps in the readiness and assessment process. The first is getting scoping right. So identifying what is the implemented system that you want to get certified. Implemented systems are infrastructure, software, data, people, processes that make up that system. Getting that definition and understanding who the key stakeholders are going to be is really step 1. Once that's understood, then we jump into the readiness process where we go through a gap assessment over all those 44 requirement statements. We publish a gap assessment report with guidance on how to remediate those gaps. And then it's up to the organization to go ahead and remediate those gaps. Any gaps that do exist, once they are remediated, those controls have to be in place 90 days before they can be certified. So that ends up being the long pole in the tent within the certification timeline. So just something to be aware of. If you don't have any gaps, great. You can move right into the assessment piece. But if you do have gaps, those controls will have to be operating effectively for 90 days. The third step is we get into the audit field work itself. We're going to conduct walkthroughs, observations, collect evidence, and then we're going to submit all that to HITRUST to do quality assurance over the assessment and ultimately issue the report and certification. All right, so that's the process. What about the timeline? So jumping into a typical timeline, there are some opportunities for efficiency here, but in general, we say, plan for 4 to 6 weeks for the actual planning, scoping, gap assessment, to get that gap assessment report in hand. And then you're off to the races with remediation. You're building out your security program. And that's really the piece that, depending on how focused the organization is on getting that done, that could be done in a short time. It might take a lot longer. Like I said, any kind of remediation that is done over gaps, for those controls, they need to operate for at least 90 days before we can assess them. And then the last piece is us going in and doing the assessment. And we have 90 days to get that assessment done. For an E1, that is a lot less of an effort than an I1 or an R2. So we're able to do that definitely within a much shorter time frame than that. All right, then lastly, we've got we call it rapid fire Q&A. What are the top 3 barriers to success in achieving HITRUST certification? So the first I always like to highlight is number 1 barrier is organizations not having an executive sponsor and also a project manager responsible for the overall program. If those 2 things do not exist, that is a big barrier to being successful going down this HITRUST journey. I'd say the second one is going to be not distributing or not assigning requirement statements. You can think of those as controls to respective control owners. It's really hard for one person to own an entire program because they're practically not operating those controls. So when you distribute the ownership and operation of controls to the people who are doing those things anyways, it becomes a lot easier to manage that program and to have a higher fidelity program. So we always recommend that. And then lastly, the third barrier to success in achieving HITRUST certification used to exist. And the used to exist piece was there were just so many requirement statements to have to think about, to have to manage, to have to operate over time. but that has really been reduced with E1. So, 44 requirement statements is very achievable, very feasible for any size organization. All right, next question. Is it possible to do one audit and obtain HITRUST certification and a SOC 2 report? If so, what does this look like? Kind of already covered this, but just to double down on kind of some of the tactics there, so SOC 2 is governed by the AICPA, so only CPA firms can issue a SOC 2 report. HITRUST is obviously governed by the HITRUST Alliance, so firms that are both a HITRUST external assessor as well as a CPA firm can do a single audit with 2 reporting mechanisms. Like I mentioned, HITRUST issues the HITRUST certification and report. We as a CPA firm issue the SOC 2 report. So if a firm is both of those things, they can do that single framework strategy for you. How has the market shifted for HITRUST over the past few years? Well, several years ago, there was only R2, which is the 2-year risk-based assessment, where in year 1, you have a robust control set, and year 2 is what they call an interim assessment or a reduced assessment with much fewer controls. But with R2, based on the risk profile of the business, and by risk profile, I mean, depending on the different factors that drive the risk, such as number of records that you're retaining, number of transactions a day, things like that, you could have anywhere from 250 upwards of 500 requirement statements. So for smaller organizations, that is really difficult to manage and operate that many requirement statements. For larger organizations with a big team, that's much more feasible. But it just was very difficult for organizations being asked to be HITRUST certified to actually go down that path. Very costly. You're talking about adding additional members to your team. You're talking about more tools and technologies. It was just a very big undertaking. And then when HITRUST rolled out I1, that reduced the number of requirement statements to 219 at the time. That's since been reduced to 182 under version 11. That's a lot more feasible, when you pair that against something like 350. So you could say the barriers have been reduced by half with I1. And so HITRUST said, look, R2, that's for high-risk organizations that are larger, more robust. It's a higher degree of assurance. With I1, HITRUST rolled out something where they said, hey, this is a moderate degree of assurance. This is going to be more right-sized for most organizations. Now with HITRUST E1 coming out this year, HITRUST is saying, hey, this is cybersecurity fundamentals. This is baseline third-party assurance, only 44 controls. This can be achieved by anyone. So that's kind of how the market is shifted. The barriers to HITRUST have been reduced over the years. All right, independence considerations. Can my authorized external assessor help me with implementation and the assessment? The answer is yes. So the reason why HITRUST allows this is because HITRUST ultimately does quality assurance over the assessment and issues the report and certification. So authorized external assessors, such as Risk360, we can help do both the implementation as well as the assessment, provided that we use 2 separate teams. So we have an implementation team, we have an assessment team. As long as we keep the independence between those 2 teams, we are able to do both. Most organizations typically just need, especially for E1, just need the assessment piece. But when companies don't have the resources internally to actually implement, write policy, project manage, some of those things will often take on that role. All right, what are some of the effort estimates among HITRUST R2, I1, E1? Like I mentioned, R2, that's anywhere from 250 upwards of 500-600 requirement statements even, just depending on the size and nature of the organization. With I1, you're looking at 182, and E1 now only 44. All right, everybody, that'll be a wrap for today. Thank you all for joining us, and I hope this was helpful.